So a very good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning to join this Blue Source and Semantic webinar, tackling backup complexity in VMware environments. My name is Ross Evans. I will be just doing some introductions and telling you about our speakers and just a quick run through of the agenda in just a second. I hope everyone can hear me and see the slides clearly enough. So just very quickly, just to recap on what's happening in the agenda today, we're going to do a quick intro with Gareth, which is about why we're actually focusing on VMware per se, specifically as the virtualization platform. I think most of you probably will be of the opinion that it's still the prevalent platform out there in the market, ahead of things like Hyper-V in particular. We then have a quick look at some of the high-level challenges that are created by virtualized environments, particularly where there's a large volume of virtual machines. We then are very lucky to have a speaker from one of a Blue Source customer from a company called Telepliant. His name is Patrick Kernahan. He's their data center manager, and we'll just do a very brief run through of a project that was very important to them in terms of actually achieving successful backups around a very large VMware estate, essentially. We'll then kick over to Jason, where we'll start to look at how we can address some of these problems. There is a bit of a semantic take here. We're not going to overly push a product here. This is very much meant to be a look at the high-level, holistic view of the challenges that are generally presented day to day, with a bit of a semantic slant on it as well. We'll touch on Net Backup, which is a particularly powerful product, which is well suited to backing up virtualized environments, virtual and physical environments, but particularly around VMware. And at the end, as I said, we'll do a Q&A. So what I'd like to do now is to pass across to Gareth Thorne, who is a backup specialist from Blue Source. Gareth, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks, Ross. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, just to echo what Ross said. So let's shine a bit of sunshine on why we're focusing on VMware on this particularly rainy day. So this slide is a pretty good illustration, I think, of explaining VMware's dominance in the market, and I guess field observations where guys in the Blue Source team go out and visit customer sites and get involved in professional services engagements. We typically tend to see VMware wherever we go. And everybody loves a Gartner MQ. We can see that VMware are clearly the leaders in there. They've got an increasing year-on-year substantial growth, and we can see that from the market share perspective, these guys are twice as big as their next closest competitor. But we acknowledge there are other hypervisor platforms out there. Next on the list is kind of Microsoft Hyper-V. But even in environments where we go in and we're looking at how people are managing and protecting their environments with this kind of mixed physical and virtual sprawl that we've got going on, typically there's always some VMware in there. Most production systems will be running on VMware, but there might be a bit of Hyper-V or Zen server running in test and development environments, and I know people are kind of evaluating this as an ongoing thing. But certainly from our perspective, we see VMware as being the dominating hypervisor platform out there. If I progress on to the next slide, why it's a challenge to back up virtual systems, we kind of like four core reasons why we see this as being a significant challenge in comparison to the kind of traditional physical server world. Mindset is a big thing now that's dominating. What we're seeing is that more and more people are now prepared or confident to virtualize a significant number of their kind of tier 1 and tier 2 applications that were traditionally siloed on physical tin, either for performance reasons or because there would be problems virtualizing it. This is now becoming more and more prevalent as performance in the virtual environment is starting to meet and in some cases exceed that and the traditional physical way. And as we can see there, pretty much all kind of standard tier 3 and below apps are pretty much sitting on a hypervisor by default. Most companies now say if there's not a good reason to deploy it on physical tin, we'll virtualize it first. Performance, challenges in terms of loading up large numbers of ESX hosts or hypervisor hosts. You really want to try and sweat the assets that you've got effectively. So when we bring backup into the equation, we add lots of additional load potentially on the servers, and we can impact guest workloads, and that might trigger DRS activity in your VMware environment and cause hosts to shift around. And obviously, if we're using network protocols to back this stuff up, we can have a significant impact on the LAN performance and WAN performance in some cases. We've got elements of complexity that are starting to crop up now. The virtual environments that we're seeing are growing. They're dynamic. We can now provision servers in a fraction of the time that we may have done in the traditional physical world. We don't have the kind of acquisition cycles that we need to go through. We've got templating, so we can deploy very, very quickly. And this tends to lead to virtual sprawl if not controlled. So we let lots of instances of servers, and typically, although there might be a team of VMware administrators, there are lots of different teams that are touched by this. This is the network teams, storage teams, and I guess most relevant for us, the kind of backup and recovery teams. And finally, we've got this issue with regards to kind of duplication. And this again speaks to the kind of the levels of VMware sprawl or virtual machine sprawl that we see, where because you can run up a machine in a very, very short space of time, and it might be running a very specific workload, what we tend to see is a lot of servers duplicated. So we get a lot of a particular flavor of OS being deployed, and this can result in the growth from a few servers to tens to potentially hundreds up to thousands. And that's really kind of, in a nutshell, kind of wrapping around where we see the principal challenges where we make this kind of very, very dynamic shift from traditional physical environments to virtual.
Thanks very much for that, Gareth. So I'm now going to just invite Patrick into the conversation from Telepliant. We haven't tested the lines this morning. Patrick, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's coming through loud and clear. So very quickly, could you just give me just a quick introduction to yourself and just to say a couple of words about your role at Telepliant?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Telepliant's data center manager. The main remit of my team is to look after our physical data center, our network, along with the virtualization and storage infrastructures, which kind of means that we're responsible for backup as well.
Okay, so in terms of Telepliant as a business, so you're a provider of sort of VoIP solutions to business. Could you just elaborate on that slightly?
Yeah, so as a VoIP service provider, our main products include hosted telephony, telephone numbering, and telephone line replacement services using VoIP. Sort of the majority of our hosted telephony products would be on our virtual platform.
Okay, so quite recently you looked at a number of new sort of backup solutions. What was the situation you were faced with prior to this project in terms of sort of backing up your servers?
Yeah, so we implemented a new virtual platform in order to virtualize our data center server estate, and we sort of seen that as the perfect opportunity to upgrade our backup solution. The majority of our technical employees are VoIP specialists rather than infrastructure engineers with knowledge of backup services, so we didn't kind of have the in-house skills. We also knew that one of the characteristics of our virtual platform was going to be that it would have a high ratio of virtual machines per host, and therefore we kind of knew we needed a kind of very robust backup solution as our platform scaled out and expanded.
Okay, so I gather you're using VDP sort of initially from the outset and using that to manage backups, for example. Um,
Yeah, it kind of seemed sensible in the early days to do so.
so your estate grew reasonably quickly, and then I guess what kind of issues did that create for the business?
Yeah, I mean, once we kind of grew past 100 VMs, there was kind of a threshold where VDP was taking its time and potentially wouldn't back everything up for us. Um, so that was an operational risk in terms of time to restore a working VoIP server, and sort of financially and strategically, the impact of downtime on voice services for us and our clients was kind of very serious.
So was there sort of a much of a sort of perceived risk around the way you were doing things previously?
Yeah, I mean, we always knew that we were going to have to grow, but it was just kind of getting the appropriate time to move to more mature backup products.
So ultimately, you've actually moved ahead with Net Backup as a solution, but that wasn't the only thing that you looked at. I gather. Can you just say a little bit about the journey that got you there, and also what sort of closed the deal, so to speak, or help you make your decision?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the journey, as we said, we tried the VDP VMware native backup product, but it wasn't scalable enough for us. So we then tried Veeam, and that kind of looked pretty good at the start, but as we grew, that backup window took a long time. Kind of the solution that we put in for Veeam may not have been that fast, either the hardware that we had behind it. To be fair to Veeam, we also tried eVault, but that didn't really appear to integrate very well with our vCenter, and it also struggled to cope with the large number of VMs. So the common thread of all of those products was that our large number of virtual machines was causing problems in getting backup windows run within a acceptable time frame.
Okay, and so the sort of last thing that you tried ultimately was Net Backup. Um, Post
Yeah.
implementation, what kind of difference has that made to you, and at what point did it become apparent that that was probably going to be the best choice for you?
Yeah, it was fairly quick actually that it became apparent as the best choice. The seeding process took about a week, and as the process went on, you could visibly see the speed at which snapshots were being taken within vCenter, as it was able to run multiple streams. And by the end of that first week, it was backing up all of our VMs within the allotted window. It's kind of out of hours, as you'd expect. I mean, we've seen far fewer errors on the platform in terms of failed virtual machine backups.
Okay, and just one final question, which I'm obviously duty bound to ask you, being I work in marketing. How have you found your experience of working with BlueSource to date?
Very good on the backup side of things. I mean, the guys have a lot of knowledge. I mean, the Blue Source have helped us through that journey, really. They've been familiar with our virtual platform because they helped implement it, and their experience and overview of backup products helped guide us through from VDP up towards eVault and then into Net Backup. The engineering team that manages Symantec for us has put a lot of effort into optimizing Net Backup within our environment, and they also put in service improvements like upgrading to higher versions of Net Backup to take advantage of Net Backup Accelerator for VMware and stuff without us having to ask for it. So very efficient.
Okay, just one last question. So, in terms of sort of taking Net Backup, you actually it's actually delivered to you as a managed service essentially from BlueSource. And,
Yeah.
and from speaking to you earlier, I gather that you are I guess the service owner rather than the technical owner of the solution.
Yeah.
Can you just say a little bit about what led you to choose a managed service in particular, and what maybe you sort of like about it.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, it's a reliable product. It's well managed, which allows Teleplan to focus on what we're good at in VoIP service provision, and the Blue Source backup team focus on their specialism around net backup.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time just to speak to us about this today. Hopefully, you'll sort of stick around. I hope if there's some sort of pertinent questions that come up as we go through, that maybe you'll be around at the end to answer them. I appreciate if you have to dive off there, of course.
Yeah.
But thanks again.
Yeah, no problem. I should be around. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So I'm just going to hand back to Gareth quickly, because he was more technically involved in the actual project, so I can give you a little bit more detail about some of the key elements of the project and actually the scale that Telepliant were trying to achieve with their backup solution. So Gareth, are you there again?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Patrick, for the feedback as well. So I guess I don't want to dwell too long on this slide, and don't really want to steal some of Jason's thunder, because he's going to go into some of this stuff in a little bit more detail. But I guess it's just to give you a flavour of what we implemented for Telepliant. And actually, it's remarkably infrastructure light, given the number of virtual machines that we're protecting in that environment. There's some 700 plus virtual machines that undergo a full backup every evening, and the backup window, as you can see in the slide, is from about 9:30 in the evening to about 6 o'clock in the morning. And for us, kind of net backup 7.6 was really, really key here, getting that upgraded and getting it running. Accelerator is really, really the big thing here, and although that's a net backup key, I guess the takeaway here is what's the best kind of level of integration that you can get with VMware to get this stuff backing up. Now, Accelerator is obviously key, because it allows us to back up just effectively the change blocks that come through from VMware, so we can synthesize full backups in a very, very short time frame. Recovery is key, obviously, but unless we have like reliable protection for all of those machines in there, recovery is obviously going to become a massive headache. So I guess the takeaway here is what we're looking at, and what we've done at Telepliant is to look to drive as much parallel throughput as we can on the infrastructure that's been deployed. And you can see there we've got backup performance that exceeds at peak times 1 gigabit per second, which is pretty impressive considering that we're backing up over the local area network. I think Jason can probably talk a little bit more about some of the other protocols maybe further on in his slides, but we could achieve even faster speeds if we were going directly over the SAN connections and do LAN-free backups. So this is really just to give a flavour that this is relatively light in terms of infrastructure. We've got a couple of storage servers. One is the kind of source target, the other is the replication target. So the backup is stored in two places for reliable recovery. And it's always good to be sceptical about things until you actually see them in action. And I guess, again, a note from the field, from my perspective, where I've now deployed Accelerator for VMware using net backup in about, I guess, a dozen or so instances, the performance gain that we're seeing from backing up, in a smart way using the VMware APIs for data protection with the integration with net backup is having a massive impact on meeting some of those challenges with these ever-shrinking backup windows and the proliferation of these kind of virtual machines, which hopefully will resonate with you guys who are listening to this today.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Gareth. So I'd like to bring Jason in now. I'm just going to unmute your line, Jason. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Hear you loud and clear.
Thanks, Ross, and thank you, Gareth and Patrick, both. I want to spend the next maybe sort of 10, 15 minutes just running through, I guess, two things. I mean, first of all is some of the approaches in terms of how you can approach protecting VMware environments, but also then to touch on in a little bit more detail some of the features that Gareth already touched on, which Patrick has been using successfully to get the most out of protecting the VMware environment. So first of all, what I want to touch on is, I guess there are really three ways in which you can protect VMware hosts, virtualized hosts ultimately, but in this case VMware hosts. And I'm just going to go through sort of the three in no particular order. One of the questions that we get asked most often is which is the best solution, and it's different for every customer, for every environment. We get lots of customers who use a combination of all three different protection methods. So the first way, and probably the way, if we look back 7 or 8 years ago, that was sort of the default way when virtualization was really starting to hit traction, is simply just to back up the virtual machine like a physical client. So install a backup agent into each of the guest OSs and back it up as if it was a physical host. Really simple. It's exactly the same as what you do today with your physical host. So there's no additional complexity, there's no additional complication. It works. It gives you the granularity to be able to pull back an individual file, for example, if you're backing up a file server, or an individual agent if you're backing up, an individual email if you're backing up an Exchange server. The downside of it is, and again Gareth touched on it earlier, is because you have 20, 30, 50 guest OSs running on a physical piece of hardware, as soon as you kick off a backup in one of those hosts, it can have a pretty negative impact on the remainder of the hosts. Now, there are ways of getting around that. You can obviously set your systems up in such a way and set your scheduling up in such a way that you're sort of trying not to back up on 2 systems at any one time. But as you start to get into sort of saturation, then that becomes quite difficult. It's also not VMware aware. So from a backup perspective, you're just backing up a physical host. But there are still use cases for this. We get lots of customers who come to us who want to back up applications, for example, and they want to get a particular level of granularity or around the backup, and they still need to install the agent into the guest. So the second method is sort of, I guess, to go a level below that and install the agent into the hypervisor. And simplistically, what we're backing up here is we're backing up some very large Linux files. So again, from a performance perspective, you still have the same performance impact, but this is very useful for DR type backups. So I've lost my whole VM, I want to get the whole VM back. So rather than in the first method, I've got to restore these 50,000 10 kilobyte Word documents or whatever the backup is, I'm just restoring a single file. Backups quicker, restores quicker. Again, it's simple. It's very similar to what's done on a physical basis. But in some cases, the fact that you're backing up the VMDK file means you lose that granularity. So if your requirement is, I just want to restore that one Word document, not the whole VM, you lose that ability. And because you're backing up what is in effect a dynamic changing file in the sense of the VMDK file, you won't get any consistency. So yes, you can shut down VMware so that the system is completely static and back it up, but then that in many cases defeats the purpose of how you can get the most of that. So back in, it seems even longer ago, but back in around about 2007, VMware recognized this and they launched a framework called VCB, VMware Consolidated Backup. And simplistically, this was using snapshots to be able to back up the VM environment. And anybody who used VCB, it was a little bit hit and miss, whether it worked, whether it gave you the results that you wanted or not. But there were two major downsides to VCB. The first downside was these were actually scripts that you had to install onto what VMware called a proxy server, but in effect in most cases it was the backup server. But because it was scripts, they were outside of the control of VMware. They were outside of the visibility of VMware. They weren't part of the virtual infrastructure as such. And that caused compatibility issues, configuration issues. It just wasn't, I guess, an ideal scenario. But probably an even bigger issue was that in VCB, if you wanted to take a snapshot, you had to copy the whole snapshot from the ESX host across to the backup server. So if you were backing up a 5 gigabyte VM, you had to copy the whole 5 gigabytes. And if you're doing that times hundreds of times, the performance wasn't particularly great, and that caused a lot of issues around reliability and stability and things, particularly as we got sort of towards the end of VCB, as VMware was becoming more prevalent. So as a recognition of that, in 2009, VMware launched VADP. So this is their API for data protection. As the name suggests, it's an API, so there is no requirement to install scripts onto servers, so everything stays within the control of VMware. And likewise, you don't have to take a copy of the whole VM. So suddenly, you weren't getting issues with insufficient space or snapshots being left behind, snapshots not being cleaned up properly, because you were now using sort of proper copy on first write type snapshots, rather than in effect a clone and having to move the whole system. And this is kind of where we are today. We're sort of 5 years further forward, and as every version of vSphere comes out, there's sort of new functionality added and new features into VADP. But from a semantic perspective, actually, not just net backup, this is the integration point that we use to plug into to backup VMware. So this slide at the top, it's a little bit difficult to see. Maybe if you're on fuller screen, it's a little bit easier. But ultimately, what we have is we have an integration, which actually we had the same or similar functionality with VCB. We have an integration directly into VMware. So we use the API. Now, vendors use the API, but ultimately the API is purely just a method of talking between the backup software and the actual the VMware infrastructure. What we do after that is certainly what I believe to be some of our key differentiators, our key strengths against what a lot of the market does. So first of all, simplistically, we can do backups of VMware environments agentless. So no requirement to install agents in the hypervisor or the guest. We will directly integrate into vSphere or actually vCloud Director for anyone who's using or considering vCloud Director for multi-tenancy in VMware. Direct integration into that, so totally seamless, transparent access, full support for just about every VMware feature function. It's listed at the bottom of the slide, but certain things like vMotion, DRS, change block tracking, block level incremental backups, all of the different functionality supported natively. Again, in the case of all of those, without needing to install agents or install additional software. Probably the most key thing that we do from a VMware perspective is we give you the option, the ability to be able to back up the VMDK file. So you're doing one backup of, in effect, one file, but still allow you to recover individual files or objects, so objects being emails or SharePoint documents or whatever, from that individual backup. And that's pretty key because, first of all, from a storage perspective, you're storing the VMDK file once. And secondly, then, from a performance perspective, you're not having to do multiple backups. There are still a lot of solutions out there to give this level of protection where you will back up the VMDK file and then you'll do a file-level backup, almost like sort of the option 1 and option 2 that I showed earlier. Do those simultaneously or consecutively to get the level of protection that we can give from a single backup. But crucially, when we're doing the backup, we catalog the contents of the backup. And why is that important? Well, ultimately, again, Gareth touched on it earlier, backup is a means to an end. You're taking a backup to protect yourself in case you need to do a restore at some point in the future. So whilst there are other solutions that allow you to back up the VMDK file, for example, and then if you need to do a restore, sort of restore the VMDK file back to somewhere and you can look for it yourself, or they'll retrospectively catalog and index the VMDK file. We treat VMware backups for the sake of simplicity, exactly the same as we treat physical backups. So the backup comes through the backup host. It gets catalogued at the time of backup. So when you come to do a restore, whether you're restoring the whole VMDK file, whether you're restoring an individual Word document from a physical system, an individual Word document from a VMware system, it works in exactly the same way. And it doesn't matter what your storage destination is. We support backup to disk, we support backup to tape, backup to cloud, and again, with a few caveats, the vast majority of that functionality works transparently across all of those different data types. And that's a pretty important differentiator from us from the majority of what the market does. This technology, like I said, goes right back to the early days of VCB when it first came out in 2007. It's resulted in us winning Best of VMworld for, I'm going to say for protection, I think that's not actually what it's called, but ultimately at the VMworld in Las Vegas for 3 years. So, well-received technology, well-proven, and trusted technology. So I wanted to touch now on 3 new features, I guess, which have come out in the latest release, the 7.6 release, and just quickly sort of go through what they are and what the benefits of those are. So the first one is the one which Gareth's already mentioned, which is Accelerator for VMware. And Gareth did a really good job of describing it earlier, but the top line is probably the key takeaway from this slide. Accelerator gives you the ability to do full backups, get the protection of a full backup at the cost, so in terms of the performance, in terms of the amount of capacity, etc., of an incremental backup. As Gareth mentioned earlier, Teleplant had a requirement to do full backups every night, and most customers, because of shortening backup windows and also increasing data, get to a point where they do sort of full backups the weekends, incrementals during the week. Some people aren't even that lucky; they don't even get the sort of the window over the weekend. Accelerator, and actually whether it's in a physical environment or a virtual environment, Accelerator gives you the ability to, in the case of VMware, use change block tracking, go directly to the change block track log, detect which blocks have been changed, back those up, so back up only the blocks which have been changed, and then synthetically, when it's completed, create a full backup from the previous full backups and the incremental blocks in effect. And what I've got next is, we did some testing with ESG, who are an analyst company around, and they did some benchmarking for us of a comparison between backing up a 6 terabyte VM, and they did it using Accelerator, then they did it using Accelerator. In this instance, back it up with Accelerator was taking 16 hours. To back it up with Accelerator was down to less than 30 minutes. There's a link on the slide to the actual report, and I know Ross is going to send the slides out afterwards, so if anybody wants to read the actual report, then please feel free to download that and have a look at it. The second feature is instant recovery for VMware. Again, what Gareth talked about earlier, restores the important part, and Accelerator meets a need where customers have got increasing volumes of data they need to back up and protect, but it doesn't necessarily address the issue of how do I recover that data. So instant recovery gives you the ability to restore data from a normal backup and boot that backup directly into VMware. And then in the background, there's a process happening using vMotion where the actual backup data is being moved back into the VM, into the guest OS. And then once that's been completed, again, it switches over in the background to be a seamless transition. And the last point is actually quite a key one. Whilst the functionality is only available in 7.6, so you need to be running 7.6, if you've got backups that you took in 7.1 or 7.5, for example, prior versions, you can still use instant recovery on those backups, even though the concept of instant recovery didn't exist when you originally took those backups. The same ESG benchmark, and this one is exceptionally impressive. The same 6 terabyte VM, so to restore that 6 terabyte VM took 25 hours previously, and using instant recovery, the restore took 3 minutes. Now, I'll be transparent and say that's not the actual restore, because the restore process is happening in the background, but ultimately what you care about is I can access the data, and the actual process of making that data accessible to VMware, 3 minutes, which is pretty impressive. So the final feature, which is hopefully of interest to a number of certainly users with a VMware environment, is the integration between NetBackup and vSphere itself. So if you have a team who are looking after VMware and are using vSphere, there's now a plugin which you can download, which allows them to do reporting and restores directly from the vCenter console without actually having to give them access to NetBackup. And that's, again, another feature which customers have been asking for a while. Just going to build this slide up. Look, I guess my closing point around this from a functionality perspective is I speak to lots of customers on a daily and a weekly basis who, I guess, have a mismatch between what they're protecting and what they need to restore. As it says at the bottom, you do a backup to do a restore. So ultimately, you need to work backwards from what your actual business requirement is. We get a lot of customers who will use a virtual protection environment where it will just back up the VMDK file. And they feel pretty confident because we've got a backup. If the building burns down, then we can restore the VMDK file. But more often than not, the type of restore request that they get is, I need to restore that Word document, or I need to restore that email, for example. So if there's a disconnect between what you're backing up to what you're able to restore from that backup, then that causes challenges, and that's where we offer the flexibility to be able to do either or both in that case. So my closing thoughts on this around virtualization in general. This is the future. I first came across VMware, I think it was in 2001. It seems like a very, very long time ago. But, Gareth talked about it earlier, but already we've got sort of 2/3 of traditional x86 workloads are being virtualized. The vast majority of customers that I talk to, their standard actually for tier 1, 2, and 3 is unless you can give me a really good reason, it goes on virtual. So this is, if it's a problem now, it's only going to become greater because the data is going to continue to grow, the number of VMs will continue to grow, and ultimately the expectations of customers, whether that's customers as in your internal stakeholders or actual customers, are unlikely to decrease. And as I said earlier, everybody uses the same API, but not everybody uses it in the same way. Not everybody gives the same functionality from using the API. And the final thought, whether you're a semantic customer or you're considering semantic or not, and this is a little bit controversial, but backup is relatively easy. Restore is the hard part. So when you're evaluating products or you're evaluating solutions or ways of doing things, then my advice to my customers always is to focus on the restore abilities. Don't worry so much. It's very easy to focus on the backup because that's the thing that you do every single night, and that's the bit that becomes repetitive and becomes a bit of a chore and sometimes is difficult. But just because you can do a backup in your 8-hour window, if you've only got a 1-hour window to do a restore, then that's where you need to start, and that's the point at which you need to work backwards from. So I'm going to stop and hand over to Gareth.
Thanks. So I guess hopefully the information that Jason presented there is useful to everybody and resonates in how you may be doing things now. Maybe you've got some of those problems in your infrastructures. Maybe your infrastructures are running perfectly smoothly. I guess where we can help going forward is perhaps come in and engage with your virtual infrastructure and backup teams. I think we're offering a backup assessment workshop off the back of the webinar, and we can talk a little bit more than just about optimizing your backup environments for virtual workloads. we can advise where deduplication might be a good fit in those environments, best practices around managing VMware backups, and not necessarily just for net backup. A lot of what Jason said, applies to other backup platforms as well. I guess some of the other topics that we can assist with around how to manage off-siting of critical backups, looking at the maturity of your backup solution in terms of how disk is used and deployed, and that feeds into what happens with remote office and branch office data protection strategies as well. We can discuss cloud backup protection options. In the age that we're in at the moment, cloud adoption is rapidly increasing, and actually backup is a very, very good use case for cloud, but you might not know what the pitfalls are, what your access is, and I guess importantly, if you go for a cloud backup solution, what your kind of exit strategies are as well. We can assist with helping and assessing how you manage your long-term retention, and again, this kind of feeds back into how long you need to keep your backups for, how are you dealing with tape versus disk. Disk these days is becoming much more prevalent because it's a much more performant platform to manage your backups on in this kind of ever-expanding data sphere that we're in. And now we have the added problems of managing endpoints now that everybody is running tablets, smartphones, and they want to store and get access to data on those. And by far and away, the kind of biggest headache in a lot of environments is managing this kind of unstructured deluge of file data that's growing. We're seeing a lot of adoption around SharePoint services and attempts to manage this, but it may be that if you've got an ever-expanding file server estate, we can talk to you about archiving, how you manage that data, how you protect it, and manage it through its life cycle. And that's a kind of broader discussion, not just around backup, but around archiving and potentially the underlying storage that your systems reside on as well. I guess in terms of the services that we can deliver as Blue Source, backup and recovery audits and health checks. So have an experienced backup professional come to your site, evaluate your infrastructure, how it's been set up, how it's running, and give you something tangible in terms of a written deliverable document that gives you strategic and tactical recommendations around how to improve that. And of course, the kind of attendant services that we do around all of this: solutions architecture, support services for your backup environment, either potentially as a fully managed service, or if you just want a reliable support escalation point with a trusted team who understand your environment and can assist in the rapid resolution of your problems. We do offer cloud backup services, and I don't want to upset Jason that's on a different product, which will remain nameless for the purposes of this presentation, and all the things that go with that around tape and disk-based solutions, how you get the best integration from those. Do you still need tape in your environments? What the best solutions are, even migrating from older tape technologies to newer ones. And we can, of course, assist with looking at your licensing, particularly around the net backup environment and other products like Enterprise Vault and certain things in the Microsoft stack. Make sure that you're not overpaying for your licenses, that you're licensed correctly for what you need to be using. And I guess, again, that kind of feeds back into understanding your environments and maybe doing an audit or a health check in there to assist you in kind of driving better value from the infrastructure that you've got.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Gareth, and also Jason. So I'd just like to invite you for a moment to pose any questions. You can do that using the chat window, which is accessible in the bottom left-hand corner. We'll just leave that window open for a minute. So if there's anything you might like to ask to Gareth, also to Patrick from Teleplant, or to Jason, just about anything you've heard today, or would like anything clarified, then please, we invite you to just take the opportunity to ask it now. Just by way of a quick recap then of what we've heard today, it's been a pretty quick sort of glance through the kind of VMware side of backups, what's really important and what we're seeing every day is that VMware is still the key platform out there. That prevalence, it's people are not changing their hypervisor platform, or making that decision lightly. So what we're seeing is people are really still sticking to VMware, and that means that the VMware platform is growing. And what we're seeing quite a lot as a sort of services company around backup is that this challenge is becoming more frequent. So the ways of doing backup that used to work are no longer working as well as they used to. Backup windows, like we've said, are getting shorter, and actually making sure that you've got the peace of mind that you can recover data in a timely manner is always the key, and is something that's very important, that's sort of frequently assessed to make sure that it actually meets what your business is trying to do. So from a net backup side of things, it really is a fantastic solution because it has some very clever, neat features that are designed purely around VMware specifically. So if you do have any issues at the moment, your VMware backups make you nervous, or you do have just a level of complexity that includes physical and virtual servers, net backup is a very, very powerful solution. If it's not something you're using already, if you're using, you might be in that sort of more entry level, I won't say entry level, entry and mid level type backup solution at the moment. And those are really the ones where you may be looking towards a different way of doing things, and Blue Source will be really happy to sort of talk to you about that. And really, the first step to doing that is very much the backup assessment workshop. So this is absolutely a free offer that we've put together specifically for this webinar. It's not designed as a come in and pitch net backup to you. It's very, it could well be, and we'd like it to be a very open conversation with you that might involve your sort of key IT people, your storage managers, your backup managers, and if you'd like to get in touch with us about that to book that in, then please do drop me an email. So I'm just going to have a look at the chat window here. So we haven't had any additional questions now, so I'll assume that we've covered off pretty much everything that you wanted to today in that case. So just thanks very much everyone for joining today. Thank you very much to Patrick, Jason, and to Gareth. You can see Gareth and Jason's details on the screen. If you'd like to drop Gareth an email about the backup assessment workshop just to find out a bit more about that, or to see when we can book you in for that, then please get in touch. Otherwise, I bid you a very good day, and I look forward to speaking or hearing from you in the not too distant future. Thanks everybody.